Hello, this is Writers at Work, a podcast for readers and writers about the joys, heartaches, challenges, and satisfaction of the creative writing process. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. With me today on Writers at Work is Gayle Feldman, author of Nothing Random, BENNETT, Cerf, and the publishing house he built. There was a time when Cerf, co-founder of Random House, was a household name in America. In a massive and meticulously researched biography, and thoroughly enjoyable, I should add, Gail tells us how he came to be that and more. In doing so, she also tells us how publishing prospered in Cerf's time when books were at the center of American cultural life. Gail is the perfect writer for the task. She's written for Publishers Weekly for some 40 years, including serving as a senior staff editor, and is now the U.S. correspondent for the Bookseller, the British magazine that covers the book business. Her journalism has appeared in the New York Times, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the LA Times, the Times of London, and the Nation, and more. Across its 1,000 plus pages, Gail puts us in close contact with James Joyce, William Faulkner, Gertrude Stein, Eugene O'Neill, Truman Capote, James Baldwin, Ezra Pound, Sinclair Lewis, John O'Hara, Philip Roth. You get the picture. Not as celebrities, but as writers dealing with getting their distinctive books to the public in the best way possible. Thus, for all the luminaries in Nothing Random, none shine brighter on the page than BENNETT Cerf. Was he actually all that? Let's find out. Gayle Feldman, welcome to Writers at Work.
Thank you for inviting me.
Gail, in your note to readers, you mentioned that you signed the contract for the book in autumn 2002. It was published in 2026. Is it safe to assume that a lot more people knew who BENNETT Cerf was in 2002 than do now?
Yes, I think that is a safe assumption. And as the years went by, people said to me, "You're losing your readers." But the trouble was, the book took a lot of research and a lot of work.
Yeah. I can't decide if that was a danger or an opportunity for you. That is, reintroducing the book public to BENNETT Cerf seems like a pretty good thing to do.
It seemed to me that it was a pretty good thing to do. You know, I've spent my life working in the book business, and books have been essential in many ways beyond my career. And this man, anybody who reads books, has a connection to this man. You know, if you read Dr. Seuss when you were a kid, or if you read Dr. Seuss to your kids or to your grandchildren, if you have been touched by the movie Breakfast at Tiffany's or the novella Breakfast at Tiffany's by Truman Capote, BENNETT published everything that Capote wrote, and he published almost everything that Ted Geisel, who was Dr. Seuss, wrote. And he published Faulkner, and he published Ayn Rand, and he published Philip Roth, and Eugene O'Neill, and Gertrude Stein, and so many more.
As you write, quote, "The act of biography is reclamation, a choice to recall one person and the world he or she inhabited," close quote. For many Americans, Cerf was a panelist on the TV game show What's My Line? I think it was for 16 years. So thus, unlike Alfred Knopf or Richard Simon and Max Schuster, he was known to the public beyond avid readers. Did his public image, witty, erudite, urbane, did it help him in business?
Both help and hurt. When I was a kid in Philly, growing up in the 1950s and 60s, he was on TV every Sunday night, and on a show called What's My Line? And my parents let me stay up late sometimes to watch What's My Line? It was a family thing. as it was for millions and millions of Americans. So it did help get What's My Line? Sorry, What's My Line? It did help get Random House books known. Absolutely. But the paradox of it, which is symbolic of the paradox of Bennett Cerf, which makes him an interesting figure to write about. Intellectuals at the time who were not published by him, who didn't know him as the co-founder of Random House, thought he was a lightweight, thought he did something awful by going on television, that, this was unseemly for a book publisher to do. So there was this very strange duality. It both helped and hurt. And I think that one of the reasons he's been forgotten about, although, as a publisher, he had great vision into the future and understood what was happening before many others did. I think he was forgotten about because so many people had this impression of him as, well, he was just this TV personality, this celebrity. And they didn't know what else he did with himself.
You quote John O'Hara as saying, Cerf, quote, thinks he is somebody on his own. I interpreted that to mean that he took some credit for what was achieved by Random House's authors. Do you think that was a fair comment by O'Hara?
O'Hara was a very difficult man. And the academic who wrote O'Hara's biography basically said Bennett and his business partner, Donald Klopfer, were the only people who could have published O'Hara, and I mean kept O'Hara, because he was such a difficult man. But I do think that Bennett himself said going on TV was like a drug. And he recognized the danger, but I do think sometimes he was more important than his authors, and he was aware of that importance. And that again, there's a duality about it.
I came away with the impression that you like Bennett Cerf.
Um, People always want to know of biographers, do you like your subject? Do you like your subject? What I felt was this man really changed American culture and did something that deserved to be remembered and celebrated. And that's what kept me going, doing the book. He was amusing. He was always interesting. I was never bored when I was working on the book. He could be quite frustrating. He very much loved stories, and he wanted to be liked, and he wanted to be loved. And what mattered more to him than the facts of the story were whether the story would connect with the listener or the reader. So he fabricated stuff, or he exaggerated stuff.
And, you do mention, and sorry for interrupting you, but you make that point time and again that he wasn't a reliable narrator of his own story. You actually did use the term fabricator, and that you had to, quote, untangle fact from fiction. I imagine it was frustrating, yes, as you said, but also it tells you something about his character, doesn't it?
Yes, yes, it does. He 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 wanted to be liked. He wanted to make people laugh. Um, there was beneath, I mean, when people looked at him every week on TV or went to his lectures, he was a very successful lecturer. they saw a man who seemed supremely sure of himself, very at ease, um, but he was really quite insecure.
I see. I perhaps I'm confessing to ignorance here, but I was amazed to find that he and his business partner Donna Kopfer traveled countless miles visiting bookstores to sell their modern library titles. In the first 2 months of 1926 alone, you recount that Cerf visited Philadelphia, Baltimore, Atlantic City, Hartford, Springfield, Massachusetts, and Boston. And in the early 28, he visited 71 bookstores in 14 cities. And you write that the bookstore owners, buyers, and retailers liked, quote, two personable young fellows whose commercial instincts were married to a genuine love of books, close quote. Were other publishers as active in wooing the selling side of the business?
I think um, some were quite active when they started out. Um, Dick Simon, who obviously started Simon and Schuster, was Max Schuster. Um, Dick Simon, Max Schuster, Bennett all went to Columbia, and Bennett and Dick were friends. Um, he traveled like that. In fact, um, he basically passed his job when he decided to go into business with Schuster. He passed the job he had, which was Bennett's first job in publishing, to Bennett. And they went on a road trip so that Simon showed Bennett how to do it. But later, Simon didn't do that. Whereas Bennett never stopped going to bookstores. He loved schmoozing with booksellers. And he, was well aware of the fact that without bookstores, there would be no publishers. Um, and he was a super salesman. Uh, Absolutely, his whole life, you know, selling was important to him.
That's where the O'Hara quote irked me a bit. Um, because if nobody buys the book, if nobody reads the book, um, what's the point? You know,
Exactly,
yeah.
exactly. And Bennett knew how to get books into readers' hands. Um, he could do it through mentioning a book on What's My Line, or mentioning books in his lectures around the country, or mentioning books in the weekly column he did for a magazine called the Saturday Review, which was very popular in mid-century America, or mentioning books in his joke columns that were syndicated in newspapers. I mean, he was one of the people responsible for bringing Gertrude Stein back to America. She'd lived in Paris for 30 years, very, very famous as the expatriate American who had the Picassos and Matisses on her walls. But what she wanted to be famous for was the books that she wrote. And he helped bring her back to America and plan her tour. She went all over America for a year. And she was like a famous actress. She gave wonderful lectures that people could actually understand, even if they couldn't quite understand all the books that she wrote. And he made her a star. For the books, he gave her what she wanted. And he was very good at giving authors what they wanted or needed, whether it was to make money or be famous or exorcise their demons or change the world. Different authors want different things. But he was also very good at giving booksellers what they wanted. I mean, the Modern Library series, he didn't start, but that's how he started in business, by buying the Modern Library from the man who started it. He made it into a cultural institution, got it, known all over the country. There were several generations of college students who depended on the Modern Library. And the Modern Library still exists and is still something of a tastemaker in terms of what is a classic and what is not.
Can we discuss the relationship between Cerf and James Joyce? I thought you did a wonderful job of detailing a rather complicated and misunderstood episode in what I would call broadly freedom of the press, or the implications of the First Amendment. I think you make the case very strongly that Cerf was the right champion for Ulysses.
Um, I think he was. Ulysses is a very complicated story. And Joyce had trouble being published from the beginning. He self-exiled to Europe because he couldn't be published in Ireland. And it took 9 years for Dubliners, its wonderful short stories, to be published in England. And then it was published, two of Joyce's books were published in 1916 by a man named Ben Hughes. And Ulysses, there were two ladies, Margaret Anderson and Jane Heap, who published a magazine called The Little Review in America in the 19 teens and early 1920s. And they attempted to serialize chapters of Ulysses. And some of the chapters that they serialized were banned. And then they were arrested for a chapter and told, well, they were arrested, tried, fined, and told, if you try to publish any more chapters of this obscene book, which has sex scenes and dirty words, you are going to go to jail for 5 years. So that was the end of trying to publish Ulysses in America for a while. That happened, I can't remember, 1919, 1920. But an expatriate American, another woman named Sylvia Beach, had opened a bookstore in Paris called Shakespeare and Company. And it was a hangout for intellectuals and expatriates. And Joyce would hang out there sometimes. And Beach fell in love with Ulysses and determined she was going to publish it in Paris. And that's what she did in 1922. But it couldn't be published in America. In the late 20s, things began to change in America. Court cases were being fought and finally won. Most famously, there was a book called The Well of Loneliness by Radcliffe Hall, which was about lesbian love. And two lawyers, Morris Ernst and Alexander Lindy, managed to get it freed in a trial. Its publisher was allowed to go forward and publish the book. So people began to think, aha, maybe now we can publish Ulysses. This was in the late 1920s, early 1930s. Bennett, Cerf, and Donald Klopfer had bought the Modern Library in 1925. They started Random House to publish new books in 1927, but they hadn't done much. So taking on Ulysses was a rather odd thing for them to think of doing, but they did think of doing it. but they had to figure out how to do it without costing themselves an absolute fortune by setting the book and printing the book, 1,000 or a few thousand copies, because that would have been a really big gamble. Also, they had to convince Joyce that they were the right publisher because there were others who wanted to do it. In particular, there was another relatively new house called William Morrow. Morrow was actually Irish, but Irish, lived in America. Anyway, Bennett and Donald published two of Joyce's books, Dubliners and Portrait of the Artist, in the Modern Library. So Joyce knew that they paid him on time, royalties. But what really convinced Joyce to go with this upstart publisher, Bennett Cerf, was before he'd gone into publishing after Columbia, Bennett worked on Wall Street for a few years at a stock brokerage. And one of the partners of the brokerage in the early 1930s was a man named Robert Castor. And Castor had a sister in Paris who was married to James Joyce's son. And Castor agreed to be the go-between, and his sister agreed to help in persuading Joyce that Bennett Cerf would be financially sound, would manage, if the lawyers managed to fight the case and win, would be the person who could market the book and sell the book. And in fact, that is what happened. And also, the lawyers were brilliant. They fought the case on the basis of one book that Bennett got sent by Joyce's secretary to New York, that was impounded by customs. And they jockeyed to get the right judge who would be an intellectual, a literary man, sympathetic to the cause. And they also had a US prosecutor who recognized that although under 19th century obscenity laws, the book was obscene, that it was a masterpiece, and it was time for the law to change.
You do a really thorough job in describing how Random House launched Ulysses and how it pitched it to, quote, educated middle-class Americans who bought serious books, and how they employed an ad campaign and other efforts that aimed to persuade the public that it was accessible, enjoyable, and appropriate. And in retrospect, it looks so wise to have done it that way. Even as I was reading your text, I was thinking, God, I would have been so persuaded to go out and buy this book.
Yes, I mean, the lawyers told Bennett, write to librarians, send 100 letters to librarians to get them on our side. Bennett wrote to 800, not 100, 800. He sent letters and questionnaires all over the country to professors, clergymen, psychiatrists, social workers, teachers, um, anybody whom he thought could be persuasive to other writers, to other publishers, to editors. And the judge, um, Judge Woolsey, could not believe the amount of mail. He was being inundated with letters from all over the country by people wanting Ulysses to be free. And then the ad campaign included leaflets where Bennett put information and a map of Dublin showing all of the main places where Ulysses takes place to intrigue the reader, to make the reader think this is going to be an interesting read. I'll be able to understand this. And also, he persuaded booksellers. Once the judgment came down and Woolsey freed Ulysses, Bennett persuaded booksellers to put displays of this heretofore banned book in their windows. This is not a dirty book. This is a masterpiece that you should read.
So Donald Klopfer considered the vindication of Ulysses as the finest hour in Random House's publishing career. Do you agree?
Yes, in that it changed the obscenity laws in this country. A lot more books, not just Ulysses, a lot of other books could be legally published. And also, the precedent was used in the 1950s when distributors wanted to get European art house films, by people like Ingmar Bergman, by Italian directors, French directors, when they wanted to get them shown in America. It was a landmark court case, a really big deal, and it put Random House on the map. Suddenly, Random House was a cultural force in America. When Bennett got his first job in publishing, working for a man named Horace Liveright, the job that he got that Dick Simon passed on, Bennett, 3 weeks into the job, Bennett said to Dick, I hope that within 10 years, I will be one of the great publishers in the country. And 10 years later, they fought the Ulysses case, and he was.
I don't want to give the impression that the book is about Ulysses or James Joyce, because you present so many revealing anecdotes about how Cerf interacted with Random House authors and authors he failed to sign. One that really touched me was his experience with Mary Jane Ward, the author of The Snake Pit.
Yes.
The semi-autobiographical story of a psychotic woman. She's institutionalized, undergoes very harsh therapy, struggles to cope. I guess more people these days know it from the film adaptation starring Olivia de Havilland. But I found it quite moving, the story. Can you talk a little bit about how the manuscript came to Random House and how it was published?
Well, it came over the transom. And also a friend of hers was involved, but essentially it came over the transom. And an editor read it and thought, yeah. And this was quite a controversial topic. I mean, there weren't books. As you said, it was thinly veiled. It really was a memoir, but it was thinly veiled as a novel. There were not books written from the inside of, someone having spent time in an insane asylum. And Bennett, they saw, it was well written. It was a powerfully compelling story. But he was very concerned about Mary Jane Ward, and brought her to New York and with her husband. And when the film rights were sold, he also warned her about Hollywood. He wanted to make sure that it wasn't, that her life wasn't sensationalized, that it wouldn't harm her, that it would help her publishing this book. And the book was done, tastefully, and it did wonderfully well. And it was important for a lot of people at that time. It mattered. And, she's not known today. I don't think that many people remember the movie today, but it was a very important book in its day.
I thought it was a very telling episode. I mean, he's the kind of man who knew everybody, and not just in the book world. I mean, he's at a party, and the man at the piano is Richard Rodgers, and Frank Sinatra's his buddy, and he's at ease in every social situation. Yet he paid such careful attention to her,
Yes,
and he understood she could be brittle, and he
yes,
understood what celebrity could do to her.
yes. Well, he also, you know, he published everything that Truman Capote wrote. Capote looked on him in a strange kind of way as a father figure. And Bennett was very concerned during the writing of In Cold Blood. I mean, Capote, during the writing of that book, became an alcoholic and almost had a breakdown. And Capote had to go, and in order to finish the book, he had to go to Kansas to see the killers hang. Capote's books often were serialized first in the New Yorker, and then they appeared as Random House books. And the New Yorker was going to serialize In Cold Blood. But it wasn't William Shawn, the New Yorker editor, who made sure that someone went with Truman Capote to Kansas. Bennett made sure that someone did. Bennett would not have been the right person to do it. He was not good at that kind of thing. But Capote's editor, Joe Fox, went with him. And after Capote witnessed one of the hangings, he couldn't bear to witness the second. At some point, they phoned Bennett and they got on a plane to come back to New York. And Joe's job was to sit next to Truman on the plane and hold his hand while Capote wept the whole time back. Bennett did care about many of his authors. Not every author liked him, but many authors did and respected him because he had terrific instincts. He was a terrific reader, and he read all the time, not just the books he published, but he did read the books he published, but many other books besides. And he had good instincts about people.
I'd like to just shift a direction a bit here. I have to say that I never thought I'd refer to a 1,000-page book as a breezy read. But I found the text relaxed, inviting, conversational, um, never tiresome. 200 pages went by in no time. Can you tell us about your approach to writing Nothing Random?
Oh.
And let me just throw out another thing there. I found that it sat exactly in the spot between journalism and storytelling.
Well,
I never doubted anything that you presented, but I appreciated how you presented it.
well, thank you very much. It took a lot of work and a lot of drafts, and a lot of learning. I mean, I had published two books and many, 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 many articles before this book. But the first book was a cancer memoir, um, about three generations of my family with cancer. And I was the one who lived to tell the story. And the book poured out of me in 10 months. Uh, and the second book was a short book that was an academic book, and that took 2 years. When I signed the contract for this book, I really had no idea what I was getting myself into. The enormous life, the teeming cinematically with characters. He did know everybody who was anybody. And, the number of archives I'd have to go to. And, I tried to interview anybody who was still alive who knew him. So more than 200 people. I wrote far too much. My editor, the person who acquired the book, was a man named Bob Loomis. He had come to work at Random House in 1957. He was hired by BENNETT Cerf. And Bob, he edited everything that Maya Angelou ever wrote. He edited William Styron, Sophie's Choice. He edited Edmund Morris's Theodore Roosevelt biographies, Shelby Foote's great history of the Civil War. I was his last author, and he died 6 years ago during the pandemic. But he was very important in keeping me going. He would say, just keep writing. I'd send him a few chapters every few months, just keep writing. And then he reached a point where he'd say, it's going to be too long, but just keep writing. It took some years to cut the manuscript. I mean, more than 500 pages were cut from this very big book. So one of the things I had to learn was I was concerned because Bennett was such an exaggerator. I wanted to footnote everything and show where everything came from. And my quotes were too long. And I had to learn how to cut the quotes, how to use parts of the quotes, but not all of the quotes. And that took quite a lot of doing. And the book, as it is cut, 140 of its pages are endnotes. So it all took time.
Did you ever think about giving up?
No. Weird, but true. Because
I'm,
I was in it, by that time, I was in it for so long. I thought, I have to continue. And that's where, Bob was very helpful because I always felt, well, if there's enough there to keep him going with me, then I just have to keep going. And also, this book was not authorized, and it is not a hagiography. Everybody has their feet of clay, and there are times when Bennett did some things not to be proud of. But Bennett's two sons, Christopher and Jonathan Cerf, cooperated with me, and they were very kind to me. As the years went by, I think they wondered, what is this woman doing? But I often thought it's like I'm writing a symphony, and there are different movements, and it's just taking the time that it takes. And luckily, I did do journalism the whole time to keep me in publishing present. I wrote for Publishers Weekly and for its British equivalent, the Bookseller. Mm-hmm. And luckily, I have a husband who believed in the book and was able to provide most of the funds to keep us going.
Well, I have to say, I'm glad you did. I usually ask my guests what's next. Do you have another book in you, do you think?
I think I will have another book. It will not be a book that will take 23 years. It would be nice to do a book that would take, 3 or 4 years. I've got a couple of ideas, and I'm going to spend some time thinking during the summer. But, right now, I'm still trying to get Nothing Random known out there. And that's my job for the moment.
My guest on Writers at Work is Gayle Feldman, author of Nothing Random, Bennett, Cerf, and the publishing house he built, an entertaining and revealing look at the life of Cerf, who co-founded Random House, and at the times in which he lived. It's a wonderful work, one I'll keep at hand and share with friends who love books and how they come to be. Gayle, thank you so much for joining me on Writers at Work.
Thank you so very much for a lovely interview.
Writers at Work is a production of Bliss Publications. Erin Mitchell is our producer. Music is by Joni Mitchell, performed by Keith Jarrett. For more, see writersatworkpodcast.com. I'm your host, Jim Fusili. Until next time, happy reading.